Karen, I believe I just gave you access to video and your mic if you want to give that a try. We can
And there's my mic. Okay. Thank you, Ryan. We'll just give it another minute or so, Ryan. It looks like people are still joining.
No, that sounds great, Karen. Thank you.
Okay, someone, Don Collier, just put something in the chat and said that the link sent out seems to connect us to the last plenary session. Okay, Colleen saw that. So obviously it worked for some, but not for others. All right, she's going to fix it now. There's always a glitch, isn't there?
That's how it works in the virtual world. All good, though.
it looks like other people are now able to join the meeting. So we'll just give it another minute. Okay. All right. Ryan, I think we're all set to go. Obviously, anyone who's running a little late can join us as we're in progress. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out this morning, 9:30 on a Saturday morning. I'd just like to start by saying I'm very happy to be in the role of ED Registrar for NSCMIRTP, and I'm looking forward to the times ahead, including the big changes that are coming with regulation. And Ryan, you and I have been working together now since I came on board, and we've been working on the profession-specific regulations. And we know that there's more to come next year in working on the new bylaws. And I thought this might be a good opportunity. Last year, you had the opportunity to speak to the registrants about where we were with respect to regulation at that time. A lot has happened in a year, and I thought it would be a good opportunity to inform them and educate them on what's happening with regulation with respect to us as registrants and a regulatory body. So I will turn it over to you, and thank you very much for being here.
Great. Well, thank you for the invitation, Karen. And it's great to be working with you and the board on these initiatives. It's great that you're able to step into this role. You bring such a wealth of regulatory and board experience that is incredibly invaluable to the organization. So it's been, at least from my perspective, a good transition from Julie to you, and we're doing some great work. So thank you for having me. It's been about a year since I spoke to the group last, and as Karen noted, a lot has changed within that past year. So I will provide some updates on where we are now at this point in time, and as well where we are going as we continue this journey towards regulatory modernization with your college, but with all of the other health regulators in Nova Scotia as well. So some of the things that I want to address with our time this morning, and I don't intend to keep you too long. It is a beautiful Saturday morning, but some of the things that we thought would be helpful just to touch base on are, of course, the RHPA, the Regulated Health Professions Act. You'll be hearing that acronym and that term for the next few years, no doubt, many times. I want to also speak about how it'll impact existing registrants. When we do make the change, what is that going to mean for you? We'll address that specifically. As well, Karen mentioned we're currently right now doing work on the profession-specific regulations with the Department of Health and Wellness, so we'll address that progress. We'll talk about the bylaws. We'll also talk about a mandatory standard of practice, which we're going to be implementing. Well, not sure about the implementation date, but we'll be adopting by December of this year. And also, there are some upcoming amendments to our existing regulations that are going to be in force as of next week. So we'll briefly remind folks of what those amendments are. We had talked about them in our last call. They've now been approved and they will be going into effect next week. So of course, the Regulated Health Professions Act is the foundational document for the modernization of professional regulation in Nova Scotia. This is just the title page of the Act itself. It is accessible online for anyone who wants to take a review of the Act. It is available online. Effectively, if we just stand back and we think, what is the RHPA accomplishing at a 30,000-foot view? And effectively, what it's doing, it's changing the landscape of professional regulation in Nova Scotia. For decades, every regulator, every college has had its own legislation, including this college. So currently we have the MIRTP Act, the physicians have the Medical Act, the nurses have the Nursing Act. About 20 health professions in Nova Scotia, and they all have different statutes or different acts. And what's being done through those acts is the provincial government is saying, rather than us regulating the professions, we're going to delegate, or we're going to give that authority to the professions themselves. And there's lots of great policy reasons as to why government does that. These professions, they are specialized, and it's the members of the profession themselves that know best. Government has recognized that it's best for the individuals of the profession to regulate themselves rather than government. But government does that with a very important caveat that the college and the regulators can never lose sight of. And that's, yes, we're going to give you the privilege. Yes, we're going to allow you to regulate, but it must be done in the public interest. That always has to be the primary consideration when it comes to any regulatory functions. It's not the members' interests that we're prioritizing, although those are important too, don't get me wrong. And very often the public's interests and the members' interests can align. But when there's any difference, we always have to promote and prioritize the public interest. So the government does that through legislation, or all these various acts that I've mentioned. Those acts were passed at different points in time over the past number of decades. Some have been amended, some haven't been amended. They're in different states. Some are quite modern, some haven't been amended in a very long time. So there's inconsistency amongst the 20 plus acts in Nova Scotia. There isn't a standardized approach to regulation in Nova Scotia because we have such different pieces of legislation. So what the RHPA is doing is establishing consistency in regulatory processes. And what I mean by that? Well, we're establishing consistency when it comes to registration and licensing. So when an applicant applies to become registered, the processes will be somewhat similar now across the professions. The same too when it comes to the investigation of complaints and discipline. We are establishing through the RHPA and regulations a consistent approach. So now they'll eventually, once we get through this process over the next few years, there will only be one act rather than 20 plus. There'll only be one act, the RHPA, and all of the regulators will be governed under that act, the RHPA. So in a sense, we consider it umbrella legislation, or our college and all the other colleges will fit under this legislation. And that's a very significant change to how professional regulation is done in Nova Scotia. But it is an exciting change, and we've been working on this now for over a year, and the work will continue probably for the next few years as well. Now, having said that, we will all be governed, all the professions will now be governed under one legislation. This college will still have specific legislative documents when it comes to profession-specific regulations. And that's where all the profession-specific things come, like scopes of practice. What are the criteria for actually obtaining a license? That's still going to be individual per college. So we'll have regulations under the RHPA that are specific to this group. And I'll speak to that a little bit further in a moment. So the RHPA is already in place. It's already been passed. It's gone through the House. It's received proclamation. It's had royal assent. And that was as of November of last year. So it's been out there for almost a year now. However, as I'll mention in a moment, there are only certain provisions of the RHPA that actually apply to this college right now. The vast majority of it doesn't apply at all right now and will not apply until the current MIRTP Act is repealed. I'll speak to that further in a moment. This whole concept of this umbrella legislation is not new. This is a model that has been used in other provinces in Canada for decades. There's a Regulated Health Professions Act in Ontario, and it's been around since the 1990s. And many other jurisdictions, many other provinces in Canada also have this model. So it's not new at all, but it's new to Nova Scotia. The RHPA is also modeled in large part over after the Nursing Act in Nova Scotia. So a brand new Nursing Act came into effect in 2019, and a lot of the content of the Nursing Act is being carried over and has been carried over into the RHPA. As I mentioned, it is establishing a common and consistent regulatory framework across the professions. So although the RHPA is law now, there are only certain provisions that apply to your college. And the provisions that apply to your college are only related to government oversight and government intervention. So in the RHPA, the Minister of Health and Wellness has certain powers that they didn't have before when it comes to the regulator providing information, and as well, the minister can intervene in certain occasions if it's deemed to be in the public interest to do so. Ultimately, accountability for the professions rests with government, and that is reflected now more so in the RHPA than we've traditionally seen. And that's not uncommon either across the provinces. Everything else will remain the same until probably 2025, probably late 2025, although that's a moving target and the deadlines may change. But we are, as of today, anticipating that the current act will be repealed in 2025. And then at that point, all of the provisions of the RHPA will apply to this college. Different regulators are going under the RHPA at different points in time. It's not all happening at once. There's only one college that has fully transitioned so far, and that's the College of Paramedics of Nova Scotia, which is now called the Nova Scotia Regulator of Paramedicine. There are a number of additional groups that we anticipate will be coming under the RHPA in very early 2025, so in January. The majority of the regulators we think will be coming in under the RHPA in late 2025, and that's the schedule that this college is on. And then in 2026, some of the remaining regulators will transition as well. But again, those are timelines that we are working on with the department. So we'll see how that unfolds. The legislative structure, although in some ways remains the same as between the current legislation and the RHPA, there are some notable differences. And I've talked about some of those already. We'll have the same act as everyone else. We'll also have regulations like all the other regulators as well. And general regulations have already been published and approved and are available for those that want to review them as well. These are regulations that will have equal application to all of the colleges. But as I mentioned from the outset, we'll also have regulations that are specific just to this college. And that's what Karren and the board and I are kind of working on right now. We are responding to a questionnaire that the Department of Health and Wellness has provided. So we're giving them some feedback. We're giving them what it is that we want to see in the profession's regulations when those do get drafted. So that's what we're currently focusing on, is these profession specific regulations. And I'll talk in a moment about what they address specifically. We'll also have bylaws, of course, and we'll have policies. So it just won't be one document that we look to. It won't just be the act. It's not just the act that's going to apply, but it's all these other pieces of documents that are in the legislative framework for the college. It's a lot. We're dealing with a lot. We're dealing with more than what we were before, because there are two sets of regulations now. But that is what it is, and we kind of are learning where everything fits as we're using these documents. So that's all good. It just is a change to note. So what does it mean for registrants that are practicing today in Nova Scotia? What do you have to do? We're having this big legislative overhaul. What does that mean? Well, at the very beginning, not too much, to be quite frank. For you on an individual basis, if you're a registrant, there's really nothing you have to do vis-a-vis the college in order to prepare for this transition, other than, attending these updates and becoming familiar with the documents. Your registration and your license will automatically transition under the RHPA when the MIRTP Act is repealed. So there's transition provisions right in the RHPA that says if someone holds registration and license on the day that the MIRTP Act is repealed, they'll automatically continue to have that registration and licensure once we're under the RHPA. So fear not, for that piece, that will be kind of taken care of, and you'll be transitioned underneath the RHPA automatically. You may have heard me say that the College of Paramedics is no longer called a college. It's now called a regulator. It's the Nova Scotia Regulator of Paramedicine. So we are moving away from the term college, which, when we think of the public's view, is probably a good thing. Because when we say the word college, I think the majority of people would think, well, it's an educational institution. It's a college, it's a school, which is not at all what regulators do. So we're moving away from the term college and we're embracing the term regulator. So once we go under the RHPA, you'll no longer be referred to as a college, you'll be referred to as a regulator. The board is currently exploring some options about what the potential new name could be, and there hasn't been a decision made on that point. There likely will be soon, and we'll provide that recommendation to the department, which will make the final decision, but stay tuned on what we will be calling ourselves in the new world. There's also some changes for the names of the committees. We don't have many new committees. We will have at least one new committee. Largely, the committees will be doing a lot of the same things as they are today, but their names are changing. And I've kind of put those up on the screen on what the new names of committees will be under the RHPA. Not all are changing, but a number of them are. And this will create consistency as well, because different colleges call their committees today very different things. There's some consistency, but it's not across the board. Under the RHPA, we'll all have the same names for statutory committees, and I've put those up on the screen. You'll see that there is one new committee, however, and that's the Practice Review Committee. So the RHPA does provide for the creation of a Practice Review Committee, and it does have to be created or established 18 months after the college becomes a regulator under the RHPA. We haven't explored this much because this is kind of a second stage piece of work that the college will be doing, but effectively, the Practice Review Committee will be responsible for overseeing the reviews of registrants' practice. There's not a lot of detail to share on this at this point because the college hasn't got into the details of what that will actually look like and what that will actually mean for registrants. I know in other professions, what it can mean is that there's some sort of audit process where you may have to provide documents or you may meet with someone with the college to discuss your practice, kind of a review in some sense. Typically, with other professions, it's randomized. You certainly would not be required to undergo this process every year or every number of years. And really, the intent of it is to support a registrant in the event there's any opportunities for improving or strengthening those practices. It's not intended to be disciplinary at all. It is intended to support and to remediate any gaps that there may be in a registrant's practice. But we don't know the details yet, and we won't know the details for quite some time, but it is something that will be implemented for all of the professions. So what we're currently working on is this questionnaire regarding the profession-specific regulations. And these are some, but not all of the things that the board and Karren and myself have been discussing and will be responding to. These are some of the items that are going to be addressed that we've been talking about. The first is the initial board. So as soon as we go under the RHPA, there will be an initial board, the first board under the RHPA, which will likely be in place for 12 months. So it's kind of a transition board. And what's important to note is the default is whomever is on the board as of the day of the repeal of the MIRTP Act will be the first board, will be the initial board, which is a good thing. We won't be starting completely fresh with new folks. We'll have some experienced folks that have been dealing with the RHPA that will have that experience for the first 12 months after we transition. After that, we'll go to what are called subsequent boards. And an important piece to note here is that public representation on the subsequent boards will increase from what it is today. The expectation is that public representation be as close to 50% as possible of the total number of board members. So that's a change. Of course, we currently have public representation on the board, but it's not close to 50%. Under the RHPA, all regulators will have the expectation that there will be increased public representation. And we think about, well, why that may be. We'll just go back to kind of what we talked about in the very beginning of the presentation. We exist for the public. We serve the public. The regulator promotes and prioritizes what's best for the public. So the public should probably have a seat at the table when it comes to decisions that are being made. It's incredibly important that we still maintain the expertise that registrants have, absolutely, but that also there needs to be a bigger space for public participation, and we do see that under the RHPA. Another thing that's being considered is how will boards be either elected or appointed under the RHPA. Best practices in professional regulation certainly weigh towards the appointment of board members on the basis of a competency matrix. That's likely the way that we'll be moving as well for this college. Currently, There is the ability under existing legislation for a registrant to incorporate their practice, and we're requesting the ability to do professional corporations to continue under the RHPA. What may be new is this ability to regulate what are called private health facilities. So as I'm sure many of you know, across the health professions, we are seeing an increase in privatization. And that there's no exception when it comes to medical imaging. There are private clinics in Nova Scotia already. And the regulator, the college has to ask itself, when services are provided privately, does there need to be any additional regulatory oversight? If we're taking services that are traditionally provided in the public system through a health authority, is there risk when we do that? And there certainly can be. So we're exploring right now whether or not the board needs to be requesting the ability to have oversight over private health facilities, and those discussions are continuing. And we'll be making a request ultimately to government, and we'll wait and see whether or not we'll have the ability to regulate private health facilities in the public interest.
Ryan,
Yeah,
sorry. I hope you don't mind, but there is a question that popped up, and maybe it was on what you just spoke to, and maybe we could just answer it now, if that's okay.
that would be
Um, there was a question, will these public members be compensated for their time? And if so, by whom?
great. So thanks for that question, Dawn. That's a good one. So that varies amongst the professions. I don't know if you can still see my slides. I can't see them, but that's okay. We'll figure that out in a moment. Okay, you can't. All right, my screen's just blank. That's all right. So that does vary from regulator to regulator. It's certainly common for regulators to give an honorarium to public members. The amounts vary significantly across the professions. Some get an annual stipend, others get a small hourly amount. So it does vary, but there is an increasing expectation across the professions that public members that are coming forward to provide their expertise and their time will be receiving some degree of compensation. It's not a job, so they're not getting a pay, they're not getting employment income, but it is very common for them to be entitled to some degree of honoraria or a stipend. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then try presenting again, because it did disappear on me.
Colleen was also working to see if it was on her end, if there was anything she could do. Oh, there you go.
I think we got it back up here now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So the regulations will also address what the scope of the profession, so the overall scope for the entire profession. We know we have 5 disciplines, and each discipline has its own scope. In the profession-specific regulations, what we're hoping to do is just set out the scope for the entire profession, which will encompass all disciplines. And then, if we need to, we can further refine that scope for each discipline in the bylaws. And one of the last things that the profession-specific regulations will address is license categories. And the default is we'll be going to two categories. We have various different categories now. Those are all going to be streamlined into 2 categories going forward. And that's going to be practicing. So practicing means you have an active practicing license. everything's good, no limitations, or conditional. And conditional would be any types of conditions or limitations that have been imposed on a license. A common one is for new grads. New grads who are waiting to write the entry to practice exam will often be given a temporary restricted license. We'll just be calling that a conditional license under the RHPA. Same conditions and restrictions will apply. It's just we're streamlining the categories so we don't have as many under the RHPA. So I did mention briefly, and I'll just note it again, because it will be a significant change if the college does move in the direction of regulating private health facilities. There's lots of different ways in which this can be accomplished. We could license the facility, we could accredit the facility. So that's still being addressed, and we'll be submitting our questionnaire to the Department of Health and Wellness next month, where we'll be making the request for the ability, and we'll wait to see what comes back. I mentioned the licensing categories that we're proposing for going forward, practicing and conditional, so we'll be streamlining those categories. Once we have the submission on the general regulations, there will be no rest for the board or for Karren, because we'll be moving right into developing the bylaws. And the bylaws are going to be different from what the bylaws are today. The bylaws today for the college, I guess I would characterize them as largely being administrative. They deal with such things as providing notice to the members for an AGM. It talks about how to vote. It talks about quorum, a lot of administrative type things which are important, and that will continue. But there's going to be a lot more substantive things in the bylaws under the RHPA, and one of which I already mentioned, which potentially would be scopes of practice for the disciplines. So there are going to be big changes when it comes to the bylaws. And under the RHPA, there's kind of two different, I don't want to call them two sets of bylaws, but two sets of bylaw making authority. One is general, where the Act says we can make bylaws on a long list of things subject to approval. And then there's another set of restricted bylaws where we can only make bylaws on those areas if we're granted authority by the minister to do so. And private health facilities would be one of those things that falls under the restricted bylaws. So we don't know today all of the bylaw making authority that we will have as a college. We'll find that out afterwards, after we make our submission, and we've had those discussions with the department. But we are anticipating the bylaw development to occur in 2025, and there'll be a consultation process once we're in the bylaw development. Another thing that I wanted to mention, pursuant to the general regulations, which have already been approved, so general regulations, those are already out there. There is a requirement for every regulator to adopt a mandatory standard of practice which addresses sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. So for many years, the professions have recognized that sexual abuse and sexual misconduct with a client or a patient is considered one of the most egregious forms of professional misconduct. So we will be developing, all of the regulators will be developing a mandatory standard that addresses both sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. And the reality is many regulators already have these standards in place, but for those that don't, they will have to adopt one by December 3rd. The network, so the Regulated Health Professions Network, of which this college is a member, has been doing a lot of work on this. So it's not as though this college is taking on such an important item on its own. There's been a lot of collaboration amongst the other professions. There's been a working group that's established, and that work is ongoing. But we are aiming by December 3rd to adopt a mandatory standard addressing sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. The last thing that I just wanted to note, just because it's incredibly timely, and we talked about this a year ago when I had an opportunity to speak with registrants. There are amendments to the existing regulations. So the MIRTP existing regulations, there's going to be amendments that come into effect on Monday. And that has to deal with advanced practice and interdisciplinary authorization process. So I'll just speak briefly about what those terms actually mean. So advanced practice is any type of service or procedure that is perhaps beyond entry level. It's something that requires additional education, additional training or experience, and also requires authorization from the regulator or the college, I suppose, before a registrant can engage in this advanced practice. Interdisciplinary authorization, what that relates to is the ability for a registrant in one discipline to practice aspects of another discipline. So you may hold a license as a professional in one discipline. This authorization process will allow registrants, if approved, if they've received authorization and they've been approved, to engage in aspects of another. And not to put you on the spot at all here, Karren, but I'm wondering, because you're the expert on the profession, not me, if you're able to offer an example of where we may see this, where we could potentially see this coming into play.
So the first example that comes to mind is one that currently exists, um, but we've covered it off by having a position statement, and that is with radiological technologists performing um, breast ultrasound. So the purpose is not to take large scopes of another's practice area, but for specific pieces that make sense. If it's a procedure or something that you're already doing and you need to add in a small component of another and it makes sense, then that's where it might be applied.
Great. No, that's very helpful, Karren. And as I say, those will be implemented as of Monday. They both require approval, though, from the regulator. So that's important to note as well, or the college. Okay, so that brings us to the conclusion of this update for today. So I do see there's a few questions going between Karren and Dawn here. Not sure if you wanted to respond to those um, within the group, Karren, or how you want to manage that.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you for that, Ryan.
Of
I'm
course.
sure that it was helpful and clearly it prompted a lot of questions, which I couldn't type fast enough. In fact, I was typing as you said, not to put you on the spot, and I went, okay. um, yeah, so just with respect to the questions that are being asked in the chat, uh, yes, of course, when those sexual abuse and misconduct standards are um, developed and implemented, they will be shared because there's an expectation that you're going to have to adhere as registrants, that you're going to have to adhere to those standards. And so therefore, they, of course, would be available and shared. So to answer that question, I've got a question here around ECGs being considered advanced practice. There's still a lot of work around what is to be considered advanced practice. What I can say is that for the most part, what's considered advanced practice is something that requires a significant additional amount of education, that there may even be an exam associated with it, and that there may be additional, whether it's certification or designation, that would be associated with it. If you are, and maybe this is a good example of maybe perhaps enhanced practice, where you are doing or you're participating in ECGs as a component of a procedure that you're doing, and then you begin to do that procedure itself, that in fact would be more along the lines of enhanced practice rather than advanced practice. Uh, and compensation with respect to advanced practice, that's determined um, by the departments. Okay, so that has to be, and the college would not have any role to play in what type of compensation there would be for anyone in an advanced practice role. Okay, it appears none of the other groups that supposedly represent us have a position, and everyone appears to be. Okay, not quite sure what you mean by that question or comment, Dawn. Um, In fact, it isn't, it may sound like semantics, enhanced versus advanced, but if you look at the framework and if you look at the definitions and the expectations, they are quite separate. Okay. I did have a question, actually, I did have a comment, Ryan,
Yeah.
something that I wanted to let everyone know was that besides yourself, myself, and the board, we did have a working group
Sure.
that we brought together that was helping us with these profession-specific regulations. So I'd like to actually thank Erin Lashman. Uh, she brought the sonography lens. Chrissy Gamache, she was someone who sat on the board previously, so was very familiar. And she brought the radiological technology lens, as did Jamie Elison. She was on the working group as well. She's with the School of Health Sciences. So the three of them with myself, formed the working group. And for each iteration, we would take it to the working group, get feedback. Ryan and I would meet again, work through the feedback, take it back to the board. So it was an iterative process that included Ryan, myself, the working group, and the board in the process.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Karen. That's an important part.
Right. Um, and I think the only other question that I had, Ryan, so you
Mhm.
mentioned about that there would be consultation in the bylaw process.
Yeah.
Consultation with who?
Yeah, well, there's an expectation under the general regulations that there be consultation with a variety of different stakeholders, um, the regulated health profession network being one. It could extend to other groups depending on what the nature of the bylaw being proposed is. There's additional consultation that's required for specific bylaw making authorities. So it does vary, but there is a clear expectation in the general regulations that there be consultation before the bylaws are provided to the minister for review, and and some of them require uh, quite a significant period of time. So we're going to have to be turning our mind to that in the short term to ensure that we're meeting those requirements. But the network, registrants, potentially employers. So it depends, on the type of bylaw, and we'll have to come up with a plan so that we're meeting those deadlines and those targets in advance before we submit the bylaws. But they will go out. It will be public. It would almost be like public consultation.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Of course.
Did anyone else have a question for Ryan about what he presented on, or even if it's, somewhat related to regulation that doesn't necessarily have to be about what was presented on? If there was a question, let me see, in the chat. Okay, so in regards to the interdisciplinary authorization process, will it be required by every medical radiation technologist to disclose that they are performing routine breast ultrasounds? So, in other words, at an individual level, is it an expectation? And will that have to be noted somewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question, Anna. So the college's position statement on breast ultrasound is kind of the rule right now. That's what we're following currently until or unless there's other changes. And I can't speak to whether or not there will be any changes before we migrate under the RHPA. So the best thing that I can say right now is that we're still just following the position statement on breast ultrasound, and until or unless there may be any changes, which would require folks to be requesting authorization pursuant to this interdisciplinary process. So
Right.
continue as is until or unless it's decided that that needs to change. But I don't
Right.
think that's been decided, Anna.
Right. So just stay tuned, Anna, and that information will be shared, and it wouldn't be however that's going to be managed. There would be sufficient time and information sharing to allow people who are in a particular situation that we may not be aware of to to contact the regulator and have that addressed. So thanks for the question. Did anyone else have a question? All right. Okay, I think then if there aren't, oh, I see someone's typing. Just a moment. I know changes in regulation can be, I don't want to use the word scary, but it is, any time that there's a big change, there is a big unknown. And I'm sure registrants want to make sure that they are um, complying and don't find themselves in non-compliance. And so that's actually very wonderful to see, um, because it means that they're engaged in the regulation of their own profession and practice. And any of these changes, we recognize that there's going to have to be good communication, timelines, and none of it is meant to be punitive or we're not setting traps for people. That's not the purpose. There will be changes and there may be different expectations, but the idea, of course, is to work with registrants to help them to be compliant. So the question here is around CXLTs. What I can tell you is that CXLTs, the regulation of CXLTs. We will be with the medical laboratory group. So CXLTs will not be regulated through um, our college. Um, so our college's practice review committee would not be looking at the practice of CXLTs. That would be through the MLT group, the MLT regulator. All right, I see one. I think Dawn may be typing one more question. Um, or perhaps it's a comment. And I think after that, we'll. Oh, thanks. Well, thank you for all the questions, Dawn. It was nice to have those questions because you know there are probably other people on the call who are wondering the same thing. So it's always great when a question gets put out there and then everyone hears. And even if it didn't come to mind, when a question pops up, then you go, "Oh, yes, I might have. I would like to know the answer to that." So these questions are appreciated, and it shows engagement. Oh, we got to thank you for the time this morning, and I think we'll close out the meeting. Again, thank you very much, Ryan. It is always. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Hear what you're saying, Don. And we will be working with the other regulator. It was the whole CXLT regulation package was done in a consultative, collaborative approach, and I'm sure that will continue going forward. So I appreciate what your comment. All right, it looks like we're getting a bunch of thank yous. So thank you, Ryan. And um, I'll be seeing you shortly. Still lots of work to do.
Yep, the journey continues, folks. So thanks for your time this morning. Thanks for joining us, and hope you really enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Yes. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye now.